Hey, thanks for joining me today as we take a look at life stories, people from the Old and New Testaments, and how they shone or maybe learned how to shine for God. And we've been moving into the New Testament lately. We're going back to the Old Testament now. And we're going to talk to you today about somebody whose name described both their past and their future. And his name is Isaac. And his name means in Hebrew, he laughs. Now, hold on to that, and we're going to explore that real briefly in Genesis 17 because it is an example of how God marks his work in the lives of people in a way that they'll never forget. So, a little bit about Isaac in terms of his person, then we'll take a look at a passage, a short passage about his life, and then a principle that we can live out from it. About the person of Isaac, he was one of Abraham's 8 sons. Abraham, for over a long lifespan, ended up having 8 sons. But of all the sons that Abraham had, Isaac was absolutely the most cherished one, the most loved, the most looked for, and really the most important biblically, too. He was born by a miracle to fulfill a supernatural promise. God had promised through Isaac, through Abraham would be the seed of Isaac, the son of Isaac, through whose line the whole world would be blessed. The Messiah would come through Isaac's line, and a blessing for all of the nations in a relationship with Jesus, the Messiah, would come through Isaac's line, and the future of Israel would come through Isaac's line. So he was a very important part of God's plan. But he was a part of God's plan that the Lord built a lot of testing into. A little bit of more backstory. Abraham, of course, was called out by God to become the father of a great nation, the nation of Israel, but also to begin the human line that would give birth eventually to Jesus the Messiah, through whom all the nations would be blessed by him as their Savior, right? If you're a Christian today, whether you're Jewish by heritage or not, you have become part of that promise. You have experienced blessing today, whether you come from Spain or San Diego. Either way, you've experienced the blessing of God through Isaac and Abraham because you've come to meet Jesus Christ. So God did fulfill his promise, but in the early days, it did not look like it was going to happen. Abraham and Sarah waited and waited and waited after they received the promise in Genesis 12. It was repeated to them in Genesis 15. But decade after decade went by, and Sarah was unable to conceive. Just nothing happened. As they aged, they began to panic, and they began to try one or two of their own plans to try and create the son that God had promised on their own. It ended in nothing but empty failure. Until in Genesis 17, God himself visited them and he made the promise another time, again. And this time he told them that it was going to happen very soon. Let me pick up the story. Now we get to the passage portion of our time together. Genesis 17, I pick it up at verse 15. There, by the way, just the backstory on this, there was a sense in which Abraham was struggling over all of this, and God speaks to him in Genesis 17 rather, verse 15, and it says, "Then God said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." So there's going to be a name change because there was a change coming in the future. Why? Verse 16. God says, "And I will bless her and also give you a son by her." In other words, he would bless her with fertility, which she didn't have naturally. "And I will also give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be from her." In other words, Abraham, I know you've been waiting for decades. I'm still good for this. I will fulfill my promise to you and to Sarah. I'm going to do it by a miracle, and I'm going to do it soon. And the blessing that I promised will come. Well, Abraham had been waiting too long. His faith had faded too much. And in the next verse, it says, or rather, verse 19, it says that Well, I'm sorry, verse 17. Then Abraham, get this, fell on his face and laughed. Remember that. He fell on his face right there at the opening of the tent, and he laughed after what God said to him. God said, I'm going to keep my promise. It's coming soon. Sarah will conceive. Sarah will bear a son. He will become a nation, and he will bring blessing to the world. And Abraham fell on his face before God and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Abraham was 100 years old at that time, people living longer in those days. And shall Sarah, he says, who is 90 years old, bear a child? So this is all, he laughs perhaps out loud before God, and then in his heart, thinking God may not be able to read his thoughts, says, yeah, right, basically. That's how to translate the Hebrew. Yeah, right. I'm 100 years old, Sarah's 90, no way. Well then, verse 19, and God said, no, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. Now, and what did I say Isaac means? He laughs. Don't you love the irony of God? Don't you love his ability to put a turn on something? That name was both a rebuke to Abraham and in their later years would be a remembrance of God's faithfulness. It was a rebuke to Abraham because Abraham had fallen on his face and laughed at God. God doesn't take that well. He said, when this son arrives next year, you're going to name him Isaac, which means he laughs, and you're always going to be reminded every time you look at him that you laughed in the face of God over God's faithfulness. So the name would always be a rebuke to Abraham. But then as they aged and Isaac grew and they were able to see what God was doing through his life and that God was indeed going to be faithful long after they were gone to build a nation, that name would also give them a remembrance of God's faithfulness. And they would laugh about it, perhaps, around the campfire when they were 110, 120. Abraham and Sarah would laugh as they gazed across at Isaac in the firelight, laughing over the fact that God does keep his promises. So this was about a miracle and a remembrance. Now, I'm sure that if you've been a believer for a while, you may have experienced a time or two where you believed God was going to do something, you wavered, but then he came through. We call those miracles. Most believers I know have had one or two. And yet, most believers I know don't give enough importance to those moments when God shows up. We call them God things. They're so much more than that. They are true miracles. And so, when God told Abraham to name his miracle boy Isaac, God was saying, listen, you're going to remember this, and I want you to remember this miracle for the rest of your life. You laughed, I moved. But remember the blessing of the fact that I overlooked your laughter and I moved anyway. And so here's the principle that I put into words. Memorialize your miracles. In other words, mark them in your mind and mention them often to your wife, your children, your fellow believers. Meditate on them. Memorialize your miracles and revisit them often. I've had more than one miracle in my life. Sometimes in desperation like Abraham, other times just because God wanted to surprise me. And I've tried to make a habit of memorializing my miracles. They don't come that often, but they help me to have faith in the quiet moments where I'm challenged, when I go back and remember the past. May that bless you this week and encourage you in your walk with the Lord. I'll check in with you again, Lord willing, next time. Hey, everybody, thanks for taking a moment to hear what's going on at Valley Forth Church this weekend. We get now into the verse-by-verse study of 1 Peter. It's going to be an awesome study. We've spent 3 weeks deep diving into the life of Peter, who went from failure to primary figure in all that God was going to do with the church. And now we're going to start to walk our way through this marvelous epistle. There are many theories and beliefs about what the major focus of this letter from Peter, 1 Peter, is all about. I've put it into language like this. It's about discipleship in darkening days. Peter wrote it just before persecution blew up all over the church, and he knew it was coming. And so it's a letter about how to walk with God during times that change and become more difficult. I don't know how you read politics or other things happening in the world, but I have a sense that some difficult things are on the horizon for believers and for people that want to live for the light in a darkening world. So that's why I'm excited about teaching First Peter. I invite you to come join us at 10:30 this Sunday at Valley Forth Church as we begin to dive in to this great epistle. See you then.